Welcome to the Calm Analytics channel. I'm Boris Tezengausen, January 15th. Today's episode will be very eventful. So, in this episode, Putin has broken his silence after a series of humiliations and is preparing an emergency statement. The US is indeed preparing a strike on Iran, and unfortunately, Iranian protesters may fall into a deadly trap. The FSB is expelling a British diplomat from Russia, allegedly for espionage, but the real reason is completely different. And the US has decided once again to strike at the Russian economy, this time by selling off confiscated Venezuelan oil at rock-bottom prices. And also about how Kim Jong-un simply shocked everyone with his work ethic. These photos, he looks just like Lenin at a Subotnik. I'll definitely show you these photos. All this and more in today's episode. There's going to be a lot of interesting stuff. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. So, once again, leak after leak. There's talk that the US might attack Iran within the next 24 hours, literally in the coming days. One media outlet writes about it, then another, but this is classic. It's a psychological operation, a kind of preparation. There are a lot of objectives, a lot of goals. There are just so many here. First of all, to force the Iranian air defense to work at its limit, to exhaust the crews who are waiting, thinking that something could fly in at any moment, to cause panic among the elites and force Tehran to make a mistake, and over there they're already getting nervous, as we say in Ukraine. And Trump's statements, which we'll talk about a bit later, that everything is fine, that the US and Iran have already found common ground. These statements, in fact, to a greater extent, suggest that the United States is still planning a strike on Iran. So what's actually happening right now? The US is withdrawing part of its forces from key bases in the Middle East. An American source reported this to the Reuters news agency. The same thing happened before previous strikes. They withdrew part of their forces from key bases. Naturally, the goal is clear, to reduce potential losses in the event of return fire. By the way, for Iran, this is probably the most alarming sign. The Pentagon isn't going anywhere. It's simply dispersing and hiding its targets. They did this before the strike. With Qasem Soleimani, when drones simply blew him to atoms on Donald Trump's orders. They did this before the strike on the Houthis, before the strike on Iran. They did it. In general, they're doing the same thing now. I don't rule out that this is for psychological effect, but there will be an interesting fact about this a bit later. And Donald Trump made the following statement. We were told that the killings in Iran have stopped. According to him, there is no execution plan in the country. There may not be an execution plan, but who said so anyway? The Ayatollah regime, are we supposed to trust the Ayatollah regime? There will simply be trouble for the protesters. Remember, Donald Trump said, write down and remember the names of the killers. Who was that phrase for? Storm government buildings. Who was that for? Now, when everything settles down, maybe there won't be any executions for now. But when everything calms down, believe me, the protesters, they will come for them, they will come for their families. That's just how the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps operates. By the way, you see how the tension is fluctuating here. Now the protesters are simply trapped. No one will let them leave Iran. They will find all of them and deal with them as harshly as possible if they don't get help. Who said that? We were told that the killings had stopped, but we remember that Putin also said he wanted peace. And what happened in the end? Then Putin said that he didn't start the war in Ukraine. So trusting the Ayatollah's regime is to have no self-respect. And once again, I want to emphasize that if, for example, Donald Trump now says, all right, we've figured everything out, let's all go home, then the protesters will be in a very, very bad situation. Once again, I repeat this phrase by Henry Kissinger. To be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be their friend is fatally dangerous. So yes, there is still another option. This is Donald Trump's double game. This statement is meant to lull vigilance, as if to say, we understand everything, there will be no executions, and so on. But perhaps the worst scenario for the protesters is that Trump used them as a bargaining chip. In other words, the call to storm the building raised the stakes, forced people to reveal themselves, to come out from under the radar. They thought the moment was about to come. They were promised help. Well, and now, if Trump comes to an agreement with the Ayatollah regime, or simply, if he backs down, says, all right, we'll deal with it later, then these people will be left one-on-one with the punitive machine of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Lists have been compiled, faces have been recorded by cameras. So this is a repeat of the story with the Kurds and the Afghans. And this really does sound alarming because Trump said the following about the protesters. They told us, that is the Iranian authorities, that people were shooting at them with firearms, shooting at Basij militants, and that the Iranian authorities and Basij militants simply fired back in response. Well, said Donald Trump, these things happen. But they promised me that there would be no executions. Or here's another one. The Iranian foreign minister in an interview with Fox News. We were fighting terrorists, not protesters. They started shooting at people because they wanted to drag Trump into a war. It was an Israeli plot. Are you serious? And the Iranian authorities have no intention of hanging the protesters. This was also reported by Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. Listen, why did they hang people before? Iran ranks second in the world after China in the number of executions and first in executions per capita. There was a massive wave of public executions, let me remind you, which were directly related to protests that were even less dangerous for the Iranian government. Quite recently, at the end of 2022 and in 2023, during the uprising that took place under the slogan, Woman, Life, Freedom, after the killing of Mahsa Amini, executions of young people were documented, 20 years old, 23 years old. At that time, they decided to hang people like this on cranes. So they executed people then, but now they won't execute even when the regime sees a threat. Of course they will. As soon as Donald Trump turns away for a moment, those poor protesters will suffer. And here, Senator Lindsey Graham added fuel to the fire by meeting with the Iranian crown, Prince Reza Pahlavi, who is considered the leader of the opposition, albeit in exile, but still, and declared that help is already on the way. Well, why do that? So if help isn't actually on the way, then there is still a chance for the protesters that they might get support. But it could also happen that they end up face to face with this repressive system all on their own. That would, of course, be very sad. And Iran, just so you understand, Iran has requested a meeting of the UN Security Council. So, when it came to executing young people in public squares, hanging them from cranes and poles, they didn't call a Security Council meeting. But now, suddenly, look, they've called one. All dictators are the same. And speaking of another one, Putin has woken up. Today, Putin will make an important statement on foreign policy. This was announced by Peskov, his press secretary. He finally got off his suitcase. Now, this decisive guy will crawl out of his bunker and he'll say something like Russia is against escalation. And in general, he'll call on both sides, blah, 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 and cluck, cluck, cluck. Basically, the usual routine. They took Maduro out and he stayed silent. The Americans seized a Russian tanker flying the Russian flag, and he stayed silent. The incident in Iran happened several days ago, and only now has he deigned to get off his suitcases. Now again, probably, that's what will happen. We've been duped. And in general, the West is pursuing a very militaristic policy, and so on. Honestly, I think for him, they'll just hand him the same speech he gave when Assad was being overthrown. They'll just swap out Syria for Iran, and that's it. The most interesting thing is that the reaction to the news that Putin will make an important statement now shows where Putin's place is in the hierarchy of world leaders. Now, if it were a statement, Trump is going to make an important statement on foreign policy today. Everyone would immediately think, wow, for sure, that means he's going to strike Iran, or something's about to happen with Colombia, or something else. In other words, something big is about to happen. But when Putin makes an important statement, all you get are jokes and giggles. Like when that mustachioed floozy Peskov announces an important statement and no one cares what that Kremlin old man has to say anymore. Whatever he says now. Maybe he got an update about the Pechenegs or the Polovtsians, I don't know. Maybe he read somewhere that he's a descendant of Rurik and decided to tell everyone about it. Unfortunately, when this petty and unimpressive lackey was brought to power in Russia by the hand, people probably thought that since he was so servile, he would do whatever he was told. But Putin turned out to be different. They forgot that the most ruthless and unhinged rulers are often former lackeys and slaves. And if the lackey, like Putin, happens to have nuclear weapons, an inheritance, and a vast country with colossal resources, then he will spend his whole life first settling personal scores with his former masters, and then with those whose freedom, openness, and independence irritate and infuriate him. This 1.5-meter tall loser can only assert himself by humiliating others. He cannot make his own country great. He wants to make other countries miserable. That is the purpose of his life. And Ukraine, you see, ruined all his plans. The suitcase Napoleon will not go down in history as a great conqueror. That's why he hates Ukraine so much. And also because that even in the 4th year of the full-scale invasion, he can't do anything to this Ukraine he hates so much, because Ukraine is defended by real titans. That's why in every episode we have an important fundraiser for the armed forces of Ukraine for different units. Today, it's for our artillerymen, for the 26th Separate Artillery Brigade. We're raising funds for the Barak 2 acoustic location system and a base station. For the artillerymen, this equipment is extremely necessary, right now. It helps detect enemy guns and strike them precisely, destroying them along with the occupiers' crews. Even in this kind of weather, of course, at -15, it's not easy, but these are people made of steel, real titans. Look at them. So let's help our warriors. Your help is simply invaluable. Together, we are a great force. Every time, in every episode, I thank all of you for helping Ukraine. Thank you for helping our defenders, from myself and from our warriors, from the hundreds of our soldiers whom you have already helped. The link to donate is in the description of this video. There is Mono, there is Private, and PayPal for those who want to help from abroad. Remember, together we are a great force. Let's help our artillerymen. There's always a QR code. If you're watching on other channels, you can use it there as well. And one more piece of news. At the negotiations over Greenland, Denmark did not reach any agreement with the US due to fundamental disagreements. Donald Trump just won't give up. He really wants Greenland after all. And they stated that there is no threat from Russia or China in Greenland. This was reported by the head of Denmark's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Moreover, Lars Rasmussen emphasized this once again. Let me stress again that the US claim that the area around Greenland is swarming with Chinese and Russian warships is not true. The most interesting question is, how can this be? Maybe this is my own question. How is it that both the US and Denmark are NATO members, yet both countries have such different intelligence data? In theory, US intelligence should be sharing data with its NATO allies. If the Danish Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen says that their intelligence does not detect anything, Chinese and Russian ships, that means this is already the NATO position. In other words, they have NATO data. It's clear that even if the word NATO isn't mentioned, if the US has other data that they receive showing that the area is teeming with Chinese ships and Russian submarines, then it means they are not sharing this intelligence with NATO. Of course, NATO intelligence reports are not public, but why not make a joint statement? Right now, several representatives of the North Atlantic Alliance from different countries have spoken out, and they stated that according to the intelligence of NATO countries, there is no permanent Russian or Chinese military presence in the Greenland area. Do you know why no one from different countries wants to come out and say this openly? Because no one wants to quarrel with Donald Trump or take Denmark's side. That's the sad reality, unfortunately. And friends, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. First of all, it helps promote the channel. Secondly, here we expose lies, not just those of the Kremlin clique. Next, we'll also expose the lies of the North Korean clique and another group as well. So subscribe, it's important. And then came some news that it would seem might have allowed Denmark to breathe a little easier. Denmark and the US will create a high-level working group to discuss the situation around Greenland. This was announced by the head of the Danish Foreign Ministry. But I actually interpret this news in the exact opposite way. That is, creating a working group with the US to discuss something means there is already something to discuss. And this means that Donald Trump understands that concessions will be made here, that discussions are about to begin. And from there, we'll keep pushing further. So in fact, this news is probably worrying for Denmark. Not just that some group is being created. And several airlines have asked their employees to leave not only Iran, but also Israel. This was reported by Dean Fisher, a correspondent for the Israeli news service N12. For example, Lufthansa has asked its employees to prepare to leave Israel. So there is a possibility that Iran in response will strike not only at US bases but also at Israel, as they have, by the way, already done more than once. Austrian Airlines has also announced the cancellation of tomorrow's flights from Vienna to Tel Aviv and from Tel Aviv to Vienna, but they say this is due to severe weather conditions. Listen, I immediately had a flashback. The year 2022. Just a few weeks, this flashback is actually connected to Lufthansa. Just a few weeks before the war started, my family and I were returning from Finland to Ukraine, and I think we were supposed to fly with this airline through Germany to Ukraine. and they tell us that our flight is already full, there are no seats left, or something like that. You'll have to take the next flight, some other flight to Ukraine, in a day. And I think, what's going on? It turned out that the airlines had already started taking their planes out of Ukraine so they wouldn't get stuck there when the airspace was closed. And that's why the schedules shifted and the seating arrangements changed somehow. So we returned to Ukraine. And here's another piece of news that illustrates how the Kremlin is trying to show that they have everything under control. Quoting, Putin discussed the situation around Venezuela by phone with the head of the Brazilian state. This was reported by the Kremlin's press service. The leaders exchanged views on current international issues with a focus on the situation around Venezuela. So it's like some kind of Vremya program. You know, those who remember from the Mesozoic era probably recall these kinds of phrases. What else can he do? Two old men on a bench decided to discuss things. Well, the head of Brazil isn't exactly an old man, but Putin is just acting like one. Who asked for your opinion about what's happening around Venezuela? You're just sitting there in your bunker and nothing you do has any influence anymore. Go read the Monroe Doctrine again and see what the United States is doing right now. This is a classic technique used by Kremlin technologists. They earn their bread for a reason when it's necessary to link the words Putin and Venezuela together in the information space, as if he's still making some decisions over there. They just have to insert that nasty Kremlin moth. And then the Kremlin press service generates news like this. Putin called someone and discussed something about Venezuela. This creates the impression that Putin is involved in the events surrounding Venezuela, that he's somehow influencing things there, and as if he's actually making decisions. In reality, he hasn't even responded to the seized tanker yet, and he won't. Believe me, maybe something will come out today. We are very, very, very outraged that our tanker was seized, so Donald Trump, please, please, release the tanker crew. I came across a video where Russians are being asked on the street what they think about the seized tanker under the Russian flag. Do you know what they answer? We'll show those Americans yet. Those Americans are getting too full of themselves. Russia will show everyone yet. So why don't you show it right away? What exactly are you planning to show? Or here's another example of how in Russia they show that everything is under control. The FSB has identified a British intelligence officer who was working undercover at the embassy. Oh, wow. He was stripped of his accreditation, and the acting chargé d'affaires of the UK and Russia received a protest, a decisive protest, not just any protest, but a decisive one. This employee who was identified must leave the Russian Federation within 2 weeks. Does this just happen out of the blue? I mean, did they really catch a spy red-handed? Of course not, almost never. In 90% of such cases, it's a response to some external action by that country. Supposedly, a spy was uncovered. Let me tell you, it's no secret that all diplomatic services and embassies are packed not just with embassy staff, and consulates too are not just staffed by consulate employees. That is, they all do other kinds of work as well. For the most part, of course. That's why yesterday I was saying that the UK leaked information to the Times about preparations. Special forces preparing to seize Russian tankers in the English Channel. British special forces are planning to seize Russian tankers in the English Channel and confiscate that oil, and what's more, in favor of Ukraine. They've prepared the legal groundwork, and they've found several more tankers, not just in the English Channel. So basically they're planning to do this. And this could very well have been the reason for this paper rat's hysteria in the Kremlin. Send some spy urgently. Let's show them that we know everything, that we can respond. You see, this puzzle comes together to show that the feeble moth, that's the only way it can respond to any external threats right now. Unfortunately, it still has an army, equipment, and unfortunately, it's also being helped by a giant like China and North Korea as well. They're right there with the shells too. So if it weren't for this help, he could have managed the first year of the war, but after that, everything would have come to a standstill. After that, the only thing he could do would be to threaten everyone with nuclear weapons. In fact, that's exactly what he's doing now. But that's not all yet. Another brown swan has flown to Putin. The US has sold the first batch of Venezuelan oil with a total value of $500 million. CNN reports this, citing the relevant ministry. The first sale has taken place, and there will be more to come, they said. A representative of the ministry told the publication. They sold 50 million barrels. So with some simple calculations, we find out that the oil was sold at $10 per barrel. This is a deeply dumping price, even considering the quality of heavy Venezuelan oil. So they sold, and I quote, 50 million barrels that remained unsold after Washington imposed a blockade off the coast of Venezuela in December. But what does remain unsold mean? They were extracting oil in Venezuela but couldn't export it. They loaded it onto tankers, but the tankers couldn't leave. And now the US gathered all this oil and sold it at auction for $10 a barrel. So essentially they sold oil that was already on the tankers, but because of the blockade couldn't be sold anywhere. In general, this is a classic intervention to crash prices. The release of 50 million barrels, essentially free or very cheap oil for the US, creates an oversupply. Traders see this and think, aha, there's no shortage, the market will soon be flooded with oil, even if it's heavy Venezuelan oil. So exchange prices will go down. But this is bad news for Russians, because the cheaper the oil, especially Russian grades, the less money there is. Putin has left for the war. And in light of all this news, in Russia, they couldn't come up with anything better than to ban deputies from publicly discussing unpleasant topics. In other words, this is what it has come to. The Speaker of the State Duma, Volodin, has forbidden deputies from raising any unpleasant topics, not only domestic but also foreign ones. I quote, "It is not worth bringing initiatives to open discussion, including those concerning sensitive topics. Why bother with half measures? Well, just imagine deputies who are supposedly supposed to express the will of the people and achieve something. Well, obviously, not in Russia. They've been forbidden to raise sensitive topics. Unbelievable. So what, are we only allowed to talk about how wonderful Putin is? How the Botox jellyfish brings joy to all of us in Russia? Why bother with half measures? Let's just go straight to being like North Korea. No one discusses anything. Everyone just stands there crying and clapping for an hour when they see Putin. By the way, let me remind you that North Korea is officially called the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. People's Democratic. There's no such position as president there. By the way, that position was abolished after Kim Il-sung's death because they declared him the eternal president. People's Democratic. By the way, they even have elections there. Can you imagine? I actually looked up some information. Do you know what the key features of these elections are? In every district, there's only one candidate who is approved by the Workers' Party of Korea. Voting is mandatory. Turnout is always declared to be almost 100%, like 99.99%. Well, maybe someone died or did not make it to the polling station, but basically it is almost 100%. And do you know what the procedure is, or rather what the elections actually consist of? Voters take a single ballot. There's one candidate from the Workers' Party of Korea, and they just drop that ballot into the box. You don't write anything with a pen anywhere, because there's only one candidate. But if you want to vote against this candidate, it's technically possible. You need to ask a special staff member for a pen, then write something on the ballot, go into a special booth and close yourself in, though I don't really understand why, write something on the ballot, and then drop that ballot into the box. But voting against is considered an act of treason. Treason against the motherland. Can you imagine? So you can vote against, but it's immediately called treason against the motherland. That's how it is. It carries very serious consequences. Well, treason against the motherland, I think, up to the death penalty. So if you vote against, they take you straight from there to prison, or maybe even straight to be executed somewhere. By the way, why hasn't Putin done that yet? Why isn't there such a mechanism in Russia? Although, after all, he's still playing some kind of the rudiments of democracy, creating the illusion of democracy. Like, look, we have different candidates here. Putin is one, Mutin Putin. They're all here. Choose whoever you want. Since we've started talking about North Korea, it's time for our segment that many have already come to love, News from the Korean Central News Agency. They have a website like that, and indeed it's the Korean Central News Agency where they write about everything. About Kim Jong-un. Fasten your cringe seatbelts. I'm going to read you a short news piece from there. Respected comrade Kim Jong-un visited the construction site of the Memorial Museum of Combat Feats of Overseas Military Operations. Comrade Kim Jong-un was the first to take up a shovel as part of the tree planting plan on the museum grounds. Comrade Kim Jong-un said that on every tree and every blade of grass that will take root in the Memorial Museum, the selfless sense of respect and noble moral duty of our people must be immortalized toward the hero soldiers. He spent a long time planting a tree together with the soldier builders. In fact, this news is about 15 times longer. That is, it is described as radiant. Kim Jong-un looked off into the distance very thoughtfully at some point, then planted a tree, and so on. Let's take a look at how Kim Jong-un planted a tree long and diligently. Look at this photo. I hope he didn't overexert himself. That's how you support the tree with one hand. By the way, heroic feats in a foreign military operation are actually about how North Korean soldiers ingloriously died in the war with Ukraine. It's not clear at all what for. Well, now they're going to build a complex there with a tree from Kim Jong-un. Take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, subscribe to this channel, and let's help our warriors, our artillerymen from the 26th Brigade. We have just a little bit left to raise. The link to donate for our heroes is in the description of this video. Together, you and I are a great force. Wishing us all a peaceful day and glory to Ukraine.